Okay, moving on to the next segment of today's show. I want to talk about, to me, a team that could be one of the more disappointing teams so far this season in all of college basketball, and that will be Penny Hardaway and his Memphis Tigers, who took their third loss of the season on Saturday to Auburn by a final score of 74-71. And before I get into any background information on why I'm so disappointed in this Memphis team and why I really expected them to be better, I just got to state the facts here. Penny Hardaway needs to be better. He needs to be a better basketball coach, because the bottom line is this. With all of this talent that this Memphis Tiger team has, and keep in mind now, and this is really my main critique of Penny Hardaway, these guys aren't freshmen anymore, dude. It is now their second year, and a majority, they're playing together for the second year. So they have experience playing with each other. And at the same time, you watch Memphis against Auburn, and it looked like the same exact team that I saw towards the back end of last year, that also last year was one of the more disappointing teams in all of college basketball. And I'll start by saying this. We all remember a couple years ago when Memphis decided to move on from Josh Pastner and bring in Tubby Smith. And then they ultimately decided, okay, Tubby Smith isn't the guy. It's time for Penny Hardaway. And I do feel like most Memphis fans really did like the hire of bringing in Penny Hardaway, because we all know just how big of a brand the Memphis Tigers are. And let's face it, under Josh Pastner for the most part, especially towards the back end, and then under Tubby Smith, I feel like a lot of people, maybe even including myself, just straight up forgot about Memphis basketball and how big of a brand they are and just how passionate their fan base is. And they ultimately decided to bring in Penny Hardaway, who was a guy that many people around Memphis obviously know him for being a legend at not only the NBA level, but he obviously used to play for Memphis. And then also, this is a guy that once he finished playing, he really was becoming one of the better and more well-recognized AAU coaches in all of high school basketball. And he did a really good job. And he had James Wiseman and a lot of other really talented kids that are on this Memphis team now that used to play for his AAU team. So when Memphis decided to bring in Penny Hardaway, it was a little bit of a different approach in terms of coaching hires, because they obviously brought in a big name, but it wasn't really a big name that had a lot of coaching experience at the college level. There were a lot of people outside of the Memphis program that said, okay, even though this Memphis program, they think they made a great hire and they brought in a big name, throughout his AAU coaching career, most of the time, Penny Hardaway did have a James Wiseman, and he did have just a significantly more talented team than his opposition. And obviously, if you listen to the show, you're a college basketball fan, we all know that is just straight up not the case in college basketball. Even if you have a talented team in college basketball, you have to do whatever you can to get the most out of them, and especially when they're young, to keep them focused at all times. And to be honest, I just don't think that's what Penny Hardaway has done since he started becoming the head coach at Memphis. And it's interesting because this is now Penny Hardaway's third year as the head coach of the Memphis Tigers. And if you remember, during his first year, Memphis wasn't very good. Well, they were all right, but they just weren't as nearly close to good as they are right now. And if you remember, Penny Hardaway actually did a somewhat decent job relative to the expectations during his first year as the head coach of the Memphis Tigers. During that first season in Memphis, he went 22-14 overall, 11-7 overall, 22-14 overall, and 11-7 in conference, and they ended up making the NIT and lost in the second round. And relative to the expectations, that was a solid season for Memphis. I do believe that after that season, there was reason for Memphis fans to really buy into this Penny Hardaway experiment. They could have said, and I was saying it myself, that okay, in 2018-2019, if Penny Hardaway could go 22-14 with a team full of guys that, let's be honest, he didn't necessarily bring in, those weren't quote-unquote his guys, then you would think that, okay, he brings in a James Wiseman, he brings in a Precious Achiuwa, and maybe this Memphis team, along with a lot of the other talent they had, especially as freshmen like Lester Quinones, Boogie Ellis, there was a lot of reason to think, okay, Memphis could be a top 10 team going into the 2019-2020 season. And if we're being honest, to start off the season, Memphis was actually pretty good. They had a solid start to the season. If you remember, they started off they won their first 6 exhibition games. That doesn't really count. But then they started off 12-1. That was really good, including a road win against Tennessee, including a neutral court win over NC State, including a home win over Ole Miss. And let's not forget, those games for the most part were without James Wiseman because of his suspension and everything that went on with that. So there was some reason for optimism. But then let's face it, on January 4th, the first game of 2020 for the Memphis Tigers, they lose to Georgia. And then after that, 2020 kind of hit Memphis the same way as it's hit everyone else, because since then, they lose to Wichita State on the road. They lose to Tulsa by 40. They lose to SMU. They lose to South Florida, Cincinnati, UConn, SMU. And not only did they lose these games, in a lot of instances, significantly just straight up, they were the worst team on the floor. They were the second best team on the floor. And with all of the talent that Memphis had, even without James Wiseman, there were no excuses for Memphis to finish the season last year 21-10 and 10-8 in the American Athletic Conference, when you consider not only all of the talent that they had, but when you consider the fact that they actually started off the season pretty well. And then I understand conference play is a grind, I get it, but you can't be losing to Tulsa by 40 with the talent that you have on this team. That is just unacceptable. And going into this season, one thing I really expected from Memphis was a regroup and say, all right, even though we lose Precious Achiuwa, this is now the second year these guys are going to be playing together. DJ Jeffries, Boogie Ellis, Lester Quinones. They also bring in a really nice recruit in center Musa Cisse, who has been one of the lone bright spots, I think, for this Memphis Tiger team. They also brought in Landers Nolly, the transfer from Virginia Tech, who was considered to be one of the best transfers on the market this offseason. And when I looked at this Memphis Tiger team, I thought, okay, same thing as last year. The talent is here. They're all ready to go. If Penny Hardaway is a good coach, then this team will find itself in the top 25 and at the top of the American Athletic Conference. And so far this season, I totally understand it's only been about 6 or 7 games. But when I watch this Memphis team, it is a very similar sight to a lot of the past Memphis teams that I was referencing, especially last year's team. Because let's be honest, Memphis, they go to that tournament in South Dakota. As a matter of fact, the Tigers, when they played St. Mary's, that was the first live game I watched this college basketball season. And I remember watching that game. Memphis didn't get off to the greatest start in the world, but after a while they locked in and ultimately ran St. Mary's out of the gym. It was a really impressive performance in the first round of that tournament, and they ended up winning that game by a final score of 73-56. They really blew them out. But then they get blitzed by Western Kentucky, and I understand they only lost by 6, but if you watch the game, throughout the game, Western Kentucky, to me at least, just looked like the significantly better team. They then face off against VCU in a big bounce-back game. I understand VCU is good, but these are the exact kind of games I'm talking about, right? When you're Memphis, and you're coming off a loss to Western Kentucky, who I'll admit is very good. They are probably an NCAA tournament team, definitely one of the best or second-best team in Conference USA, and they lose that game by 6. And when they lost that game, not only did they lose, but they also missed out on an opportunity at West Virginia, who we know is one of the better teams in all of college basketball. They ended up winning the tournament in the championship game against Western Kentucky. If Memphis wins that game, then they get an opportunity at West Virginia. They lose to Western Kentucky, and I just wanted Memphis to come out in that third-round game against VCU, the third-place game, and they didn't only lose, but once again, they got blitzed. There wasn't a second during that game that I thought, okay, Memphis is the better team, and I feel confident in them winning. And for me, the biggest culprit in that situation is Penny Hardaway. Because let's face facts, this team has way too much talent to be this bad. When you look at this roster, Lester Quinones, Landers Nollies, DJ Jeffries, Boogie Ellis, Damian Baugh, Malcolm Dandridge, Musa Cisse. There are so many really good players on this Memphis team that really has not been able to get the job done. And when you look at some of the other pieces, you hope that, okay, maybe DeAndre Williams comes back and maybe he can make an impact. But at the same time, I'm not necessarily sure if Memphis, what they need to get better is another scorer. I think maybe the argument could be they need one less scorer, maybe some less cooks in the kitchen, and maybe a guy like DJ Jeffries or a guy like Landers Nollies could really establish their role in the offense and really be that, go-to shot maker. But Memphis is just too selfish right now, and they're not playing good enough basketball when you consider all of the talent they have on this team. There was no reason why Memphis should have lost to Auburn. Because let's face facts. I understand Auburn, they're a very good program, and Bruce Pearl is one of the better coaches in all of college basketball. But if Bruce Pearl had this roster that Memphis had, I feel pretty confident that they would be a top 10 team. Bruce Pearl took an Auburn team that, let's face it, Auburn is a very good basketball program. I get it. But they lost their top 6 leading scorers from last year's squad. And let's not forget, this Auburn team isn't even eligible for the NCAA tournament. And obviously you feel bad for those guys, but at the same time, that just adds to the reasons why there are zero excuses that Memphis should have lost this game. And to be honest, right now, if you ask me, is Memphis an NCAA tournament team? I'm leaning towards saying no. Because even though I do think at the top of the AAC, besides Houston, it's wide open, I understand SMU is pretty good. Cincinnati hasn't really peaked yet, but I think they're a very good basketball team. And there are no excuses for Memphis to be this bad. They can't be losing to Auburn, especially when they have the lead most of the game. But even when they had the lead, it was clear to me that not only was Justin Powell of Auburn the best player on the floor, and Memphis just could not shut him down to save their lives. Same with Allen Flanagan of Auburn. He was super impressive. This Memphis team needs to be better. Penny Hardaway needs to be better, and there are really no excuses. We'll see what they do in AAC conference play. They will have Tulane, Tulsa, and South Florida to start off. Those are 3 very winnable games. I want to see them get the job done there. But Memphis is going to be, to me, one of the more fascinating teams in all of college basketball to monitor because the talent is there, but to me, right now, the coaching is not.